Topic of this Dhamma talk this evening is patience. Patience in the Pali scriptural language known as Khanti. In Sanskrit it's Kshanti. Now, this certain particular mental quality is certainly relevant and has a connection to loving kindness, and certainly on the last Sunday, Marcia gave a talk on loving kindness metta. Now, both of those certain qualities, namely patience as well as certain loving kindness, are forms of wholesome, positive mental factors that certainly come under the manifestation of the mental factor, the wholesome mental factor of non-hatred, adasa. And that manifestation is as agreeableness. So agreeableness certainly then usually comprises of mental virtues such as loving kindness, such as gentleness, friendliness, and patience. The characteristic of this non-hatred, adasa, in the Pali scriptural language is a lack of ferocity or a lack of ferocity, and then its function is twofold, namely as removal of annoyance as well as removal of fever, mental fever, and certainly the manifestation is as given, namely agreeableness. Now, in the course of this talk on patience, we'll cover first its nature. So what exactly is meant by patience? And this is actually not so easy to do. And once this has been clarified, then we shall go on to look at patience in the practice. So cases when patience is required. This will be followed by various reflections that might help to bring about certain patience, and then finally a few stories from the time of the Buddha that certainly then exemplify patience. So patience as certainly exercised by the Buddha. And then at the very end there is a short section on the Vepaciti Sutta, a discourse from the Samyutta Nikaya that certainly then speaks about or clarifies the qualities of patience, and clarifies that patience is not the same thing as weakness or acting out of fear. Patience is to also state this right away, a quality that certainly we do need in the meditation practice, yes, and certainly otherwise in life, no. Outside of retreat, it's certain impatience will rule. Well, that's not the case. Patience is equally important during intensive practice as well as outside of intensive retreat. Now, in a general manner, we could certainly state that patience is a wholesome mental factor that usually arises and strengthens arises out of and strengthens through mindfulness meditation. And it could be even described as a quality of someone who has done a fair amount of practice. Now, there are a number of passages in the text that deal with patience, and some of those we shall look at in the course of this discourse. Now, in terms of a distinct or a clear-cut definition of patience, the Dhamma Sangani offers the following, namely, it says this Khanti is forbearance, and with this it is being patient. Synonymous term would be endurance, not being truculent, being coherent in speech, and being good-tempered. Now, these qualities or characteristics of patience or synonyms for patience could also be expressed in a different way, namely as number one, the aspect of the ability of a person to forgive, kamanata in the Pali scriptural language. A further aspect or quality of patience comes as enduring or bearing up, adivasanata in the Pali scriptural language, plus achindika, meaning gentleness. And when there's certain gentleness, it goes certainly without saying that there's also a freedom from harshness, anasurupo in Pali. And finally, yet another aspect of patience is contentment of the mind. Now, when we say gentleness, it means the same thing as absence of ferocity, and ferocity being the characteristic of the unwholesome mental state of anger. Now, absence of bluntness has been suggested as another way of expressing freedom from harshness. In various certain social situations, we might at times want to correct something, and we might think that we have an important point to make. And however, we might know that this could be a bit painful for the listeners, and then nonetheless we simply say things in a blunt, in a harsh manner, without regard for the feelings of others. And this is not necessary. This is not the idea, or not part of this mental quality of patience. Now, one of the aspects of patience, as mentioned, I mean the second one, is to endure, or endurance. And this particular aspect in one of the Jatakas, in the third volume of the Jataka, gets certainly explained as the psychological ability of a person not to become angered when one is reviled, beaten, and slandered by others. So not to allow anger to arise, which would be the normal reaction for those who do not pay much attention to the development of the mind. Now, this particular aspect of patience, namely this aspect of endurance, does get mentioned in other passages of the text. Now, this aspect of endurance is also said to be one of the qualities, the ideal qualities of a righteous ruler. So even though a righteous ruler of a country might be attacked in various ways, and there's no shortage of ways of doing this, yet the ruler does not lose his or her temper. Now, the commentary to the Charya Pitaka has or contains a definition of this mental factor of patience in the classical fourfold way, and it then says that the characteristic of patience is acceptance, and its function is to endure the desirable as well as the undesirable, and this function is very important for us in our meditation practice. So we cannot choose to have non-stop only desirable experiences. In life in general, it cannot or it would be unrealistic to think that one will have desirable, pleasurable experiences all the time. Now, its manifestation of patience is as tolerance or as non-opposing. And non-opposing being, to mention this, the second characteristic of adosa, non-hatred. The first one being a lack of ferocity. Now, the proximate cause, so the nearest cause for the arising of patience, is certainly given as seeing things as they really are. So to see things according to reality. Now, loving kindness and certain patience are somewhat related or somewhat close to one another, but certainly yet not quite the same. And it is loving kindness that covers a far wider range, namely the wish for the welfare and happiness of beings, whereas certainly in the case of patience, it is the ability to endure various kinds of provocation and certainly to remain calm without certain anger. Now, an important aspect of patience gets revealed when it comes to the form of patience as a perfection, a so-called paramis, or quality to be developed. Now, the main rationale here of patience as a perfection is to simply see that we live in an imperfect world and that we deal with imperfect people. Obviously, there's always the ideal for ourselves as for others to be perfect. Sometimes we might think we get someone close to it, but for others, they may seem perfect, or some may seem perfect for a while, and then sooner or later we find out this or that flaw, and then we see their failings, their shortcomings, and thus it's time to practice then patience with regard to their imperfections. Now, this is an important aspect, especially when we live in or outside of retreat in society. So we do have to then relate or interact with others. So on occasion, that idea or that expectation of others to be perfect might come up, and then it's important to see this certain expectation and simply to let go of it. And when one does see the failing, the shortcoming, the imperfection of another being, just to recognize, well, that's the way it is in life, and not to get upset because of this. Now, apart from the Buddha, there's probably no one who would qualify as being totally perfect in every sense. Or would you have an example? Yes? No? No. During intensive practice, as well as certainly in life itself, there will be plenty of occasions, plenty of opportunities for us to practice and develop our patience. Now, one area that certainly tends to easily incite a conflict, or can easily lead to some misunderstanding, is the area of speech, of communication among human beings. Now, even though we have a mouth and we have a mind to think with, yet it happens time and again that we say things that later on we regret. And things that are clearly insulting or denigrating or clearly hurting the feelings of another person. or in our way of verbal communication, we could make it really clear to another person that we have no respect for him or her. Now, this too will then, or might certainly then lead to some strong objections. Now, the Buddha has the following really valuable advice to give when it comes to communication. Now, and to think of communication, not just one occasion of communication, but think of it as as thousands and thousands of times of communication that have occurred so far up to now, and that will occur until the time that comes to move on. Now, in the 21st discourse of the Majjhima Nikaya, paragraph 11, the Buddha states as follows: there are these 5 courses of speech that others may use when they address you. Their speech may be timely or untimely, true or untrue, gentle or harsh, connected with good or with harm, spoken with a mind of loving kindness or with inner hate. When others address you, their speech may be timely or untimely, and so on and so forth. So in the course of a lifetime, we will not be able to choose how others are going to talk to us. Some will be maybe cultured, will be mindful, choose their words really carefully, and will avoid anything that might suddenly hurt your feelings, but not everyone is like this. And once in a while, you might come across someone who either deliberately or unintentionally says something that hurts you, that really deeply hurts your feelings, and strong emotions well up. So to simply consider that both agreeable speech and unagreeable, that we will have to put up with the speech of others that is agreeable at times and at other times not. Now, with regard to this certain particular passage, there's certainly more, or there's more that could be said. Our own speech could at times be timely or untimely, could be true or not true, could be gentle or harsh, connected with good or with harm, and spoken with a mind of loving kindness or with inner hate. Now, during an intensive mindfulness retreat, most of our attention goes towards certain observing objects as they occur in the body and certain in the mind, and this is done silently, so we do not communicate that much, except for maybe the interviews and occasions when we need something. Which means we don't certainly have much opportunity to practice mindfulness in speaking. However, we might certainly nonetheless take these these aspects that the Buddha are speaking about with us, and then apply them to our everyday communications. Mindful communications, which means before we actually say something, so an intention to say something arises, then it would be time to be mindful of this, and then to briefly check whether what one is intending to say is beneficial or not, has a purpose or a proper purpose or not, and whether it's suitable or not. So if we find that something is beneficial yet not suitable, then it might be better not to say what is on our tongue. So that's one aspect. Now, the aspect of timing what we want to say is a really important aspect. The Venerable Sayadaw Pandita Bhimamsa of Burma is a great master in perfectly timing his communications. And when someone is upset, however he wants to communicate something to this person, he will simply just not say what needs to be said. But when that same person is in a different state of mind and quite balanced, then he will say whatever needs to be said. So if you're not doing it already, do pay attention to this timing aspect in communication. Now, also, whether something that we're going to say is true or not. Now, among retreatants, we find that if at first not too much attention is being paid to this aspect, yet with an intensification or with a deepening of our mindfulness practice and our mindfulness improving, we become more aware of the subtleties of what we're going to say, and whether something is really true or not, whether something is fully true or it may be just a half truth. And so then during interviews, on occasion it might certainly happen that certain retreatant makes a certain statement about this or that object, and then the interview ends, and the following interview the retreatant comes and says, "Oh, may I clarify, what I said last time wasn't quite 100% true." So that certainly gives you an idea of how over time our sense for truthfulness in speech improves. So before we say something that might have a negative impact or not, we should simply check whether it's going to be gentle speech or harsh speech. If it's clearly harsh speech, and there's no benefit to it, it's not suitable, then for sure it's best not to engage in it. Now, as a parent, when we see our kids making a mistake, and the mistake basically hurts the children, then so let's say certain a bit rough behavior or so, then the parents do need to bring it up, yet with a wholesome intention, not to harm the child, but rather for the good of the child. Again, we want to check whether what we're going to say is occurring with or coming out of a mind of loving kindness or out of inner hate. So if it's out of anger, then obviously not to proceed to leave what was intended to be said, to leave that unsaid. Now, the Buddha recommends that if, to go back to this passage, if at times we get spoken to in an inappropriate way, through harsh language and out of a motivation of inner hate, then not to get upset, not to get angry with this, but rather to simply endure it and not to say anything in return. Now, sometimes we, or some of us, have deeply instilled the notion in the mind. Others need to be patient with me and my shortcomings, but no need for me to be patient with their shortcomings. Now, in this regard, the Venerable Sayadaw Pandita Bewams of Burma is suggested, or has coined a phrase saying, "Let it be such that one shall have patience with others, and not others shall have patience with oneself." So, not to intentionally test others' patience. So to ensure that one's own behavior is flawless. Now, when it comes to patience in our own meditation practice, just like in interacting with others in communication, at times we have to hear words that might not be to our liking, that are not soothing and pleasing to the ears, and at other times words could be quite pleasing. In the same way, when we do the practice, at times we come across experiences that are desirable, and at other times we will come across certain experiences that are undesirable, be those physical or mental phenomena. And the message here is, be patient. Now, be also patient with, let's say, the failings of your fellow retreatants, and you might certainly also want to be patient with the advice on occasion given by a teacher. So if a teacher says something that might not necessarily be to your liking, or maybe there's a word in there that you have difficulty with, then please don't right away start attacking the teacher. Our lives as teachers is not always easy. Now, but knowing knowing what's or the unfolding of the practice, knowing some of the experiences that are likely to arise among the retreatants, it is with patience that a teacher then can put up with such attacks. Now, if we have patience on both sides, the yogi's side and the teacher's side, then there shouldn't be a problem. Now, we need patience with regard to so many things. If you think of our retreat here, if you think of the last 2 weeks, during the first couple of, or during more or less the entire first week, we had wonderful weather. Sunny, bright, warm weather. And then things changed, and now lately it's a bit colder and more windy. Now, there's just no way that we can influence the weather and make it or engineer it in such a way that it will be to our liking. So, what is then required is really patience. Now, as briefly outlined or briefly stated at the outset of the talk, even if even when we start with our practice, and even if we tend to be of a rather impatient nature, yet practice itself, so thousands and thousands of times observing the rising, falling movement of the abdomen and all those many other objects, will gradually make out of us impatient beings rather patient beings. So a general development can be described, namely, from impatience gradually going to more and more patience. And certainly this development of an increasing patience in our meditation practice will then have, or might have, some immediate benefits once the retreat is over and we go back into our normal life. And then when we have to face the imperfections or the failings, imperfections of others. Now, in the course of an intensive retreat, we're likely to come across difficult bodily formations many times, your famous pains and aches, and stiffness and hardness and heat and cold and so on. And much more challenging are actually the unwholesome mental states. And it is with regard to both difficult bodily formations as well as difficult mental formations that we do need plenty of patience. Now, generally speaking, it could be stated that those retreatants who tend to be a bit on the impatient side and who are really eager to have big or quick progress in the practice will gain the Dhamma really quickly? Not really. So the quality that very much is certainly required in our meditation practice is indeed patience. The Burmese have a saying for this, say Shema, Seishiman Niban Yote, which means only when the mind is patient, only when patience is there, will one gain Nibbana. So next time around, when some challenge arises in your practice, then why not decide to just be patient with it, and to maybe remind yourself of the fact that this particular phenomenon is not going to be around forever. Now, once you deeply realize this, then there really shouldn't be a problem. Patience is needed in both the Vipassana meditation practice as well as Samatha meditation. Now, in the context of loving kindness meditation, intensive metta jhana or intensive metta jhana meditation or practice, it is recommended in the Visuddhimagga recommends that before one starts practicing, one first reflect on the disadvantages of anger, and the main disadvantage here of really intense raging anger in the worst case would be, well, violence. Yes, one might even, violence might go as far as killing another living being. So there's not much good that comes out of that. So having seen the disadvantages of hatred, then the Visuddhimagga recommends that one go on, reflect on the advantage of patience as is described in the texts in different ways, such as in Dhammapada verse 184, the best moral practice is patience and forbearance. The Digha Nikaya says no nibbana, there's no nibbana higher than forbearance. The Samyutta Nikaya, in the one passage in the first volume, says there is no greater thing exists than patience. So patience is a quality that is being extolled in the texts on many occasions. Now, if you happen to be a thoroughly impatient person, and this certainly would not be surprising in our society, could we keep that for later on? Yeah, please.
Patience.
Yeah. So, if we do want to tackle this impatience, then the author of the Charya Pitaka, namely Acharya Dhammapada, has some really good advice to give. Namely, it gives a number, at least 20, 30 different reflections that might help to bring about some patience. Now, one of those reflections concerns the monastics, namely that patience is the strength of the recluses and Brahmins. Now, just imagine you were to live and you would have to observe, let's say, 227 monastic vows for the monks, or over 300 monastic vows for Buddhist Nana Bhikkhuni, or I've been told in the Jewish tradition there are over 600 rules that the followers are expected to observe. Now, if you find yourself in something like this, then there's so many things that you cannot do. So let's say in Israel, on Saturday is your Sabbath day, and on the Sabbath day you're not supposed to use any electricity. So, which means you can't watch TV, and you can't listen to the news, and you might not be able to use your computer, and so on and so forth. Now, if you happen to then live in such a context, then one of the ways of dealing with it is simply patience. Just to accept things as they are, to endure and not to oppose. And over time, this quality of patience then gradually gets stronger and stronger. Now, another helpful reflection on patience is as follows: those who lack patience are afflicted in this world and apply themselves to actions which will lead to their affliction in the life to come. So in other words, those who are impatient will then have to face the negative consequences not only of their actions, not only in this very existence, but also they'll have to face the karmic results of their unwholesome actions in the future. So there is not much good that comes out of impatience. Now, if you happen to be challenged by someone time and again, someone who really drives you to your limits, and you're really close to exploding, well, then simply reflect like this. If there were in this world no wrongdoer, no person to challenge you, how could you accomplish the perfection of patience? So see the person who is challenging you as a benefactor, as someone who helps you to develop patience. If you were to live in a world where everyone is just friendly to you, how are you going to ever learn patience? Or Acharya Dhammapada recommends, see others as your children. And why should one get angry over the misdeeds done out of ignorance by one's own children? Now also, when some conflict has arisen, it's important not to get lost in this finger pointing, always pointing the fingers at others, but also to see one's own contribution to this situation, and then to make necessary amends. Now, these are just some of the reflections stated by Acharya Dhammapala. Many years ago, there was an article in the Inquiring Mind, and I think it was on patience, and a really neat reflection was recommended there. If you're totally upset about something that is happening right now, and something that seems so important, simply think of yourself or think of the situation in 250 years. So 250 years down the road, and then you look back at this big issue that you're facing right now, and so 250 years from now, this big issue that you're facing now will still appear big or not. It will probably appear as some minor, negligible issue. So that would be one way of dealing with it. Now, since the mental virtue or mental quality of patience is an aspect of non-hatred, of adosa, and adosa is the opposite to dosa, namely hatred, ill will, anger, grudge, and so on. There is, if we take patience really seriously, there is no reason to get angry. No reason whatsoever in the world. Now, sometimes we might think that our anger is justified, but ultimately there is no justification for anger whatsoever. Acting out of anger in the end will be or will bring harm to oneself as well as to others, and to both oneself and others. Now, on one occasion, it was Devadatta, the cousin of the Buddha, who held a strong grudge against the Buddha, and he convinced the tamer of an elephant, the owner of an elephant, to get the elephant Nalagiri intoxicated, and then let that intoxicated elephant charge towards the Buddha. And so it actually happened that way. One day the Buddha came along, and all of a sudden he found himself facing this fierce and highly intoxicated elephant Nalagiri. And it is in this situation that the Buddha used his ability of radiating strong loving kindness, and he radiated loving kindness to the charging elephant Nalagiri, and the elephant came to a stop. Not only this, but even bowed down or kneel down in front of the Buddha. So it was with loving kindness that the Buddha mastered this situation, and it was with patience that he did not lose his temper, did not get angry with his cousin Devadatta. On one occasion, Devadatta tried to destroy the life of the Buddha's life by rolling a huge boulder from the peak of the mountain down the slope onto the road where the Buddha just came walking along. Fortunately, the Buddha managed to not get hit or to avoid the boulder, yet his foot was hurt by a splinter, which then led his foot to bleed profusely. Again, any other person would probably get angry with Devadatta, not so the Buddha. There are other such cases when heretics who were envious of the Buddha and his success, his great number of disciples, who those heretics who then try to simulate a situation where a woman was hired and she was then told, you just hang around where the Buddha and his disciples are residing, and then giving the impression that you're close visitor and close to the Buddha, close to the monastics, and sometime later this woman then was murdered, and then the heretics went around falsely accusing the Buddha of murder. Now, in all of these cases, the Buddha remained pretty patient. On one such occasion, when the heretics were trying to give him a hard time, and were going around and falsely accusing the Buddha in town for 7 days, it was Elder Ananda who approached the Buddha and said, "Come on, let's go somewhere else. This is not a good place to be at." And what do you think the Buddha's response was? Did he say, "Okay, yes, I agree, let's go somewhere else and we'll have peace of mind"? Not at all. He denied or refused Ananda's request and said, "Let us stay here and the whole thing will be over." So a case again of patience. Now, the Samyutta Nikaya contains the so-called Vepaccitti Sutta, the discourse on Vepaccitti, the king of the Asuras. And this discourse is about a battle that apparently took place between the Devas and then the Asuras. The Devas being led by Lord Sakka. Now, a big battle unfolded, and eventually the Devas won or were victorious, and then captured Vepaccitti, the king of the Asuras, and imprisoned him. One day, so the story goes, then Sakka, the lord of the Devas, went to visit the prison where Vepaccitti was locked up. And immediately upon entering the prison cell, Wepachiti then abused, reviled Lord Saka with rude and harsh words. Now, Saka did not respond in any way, did not show the slightest degree of anger. After this whole event was over, it was the Saka's charioteer who had witnessed what had gone on, and who then had some questions, had some doubts. And so he then questioned Saka about the usefulness of patience. And he questioned, basically he was saying, well, this patience of yours is just a sign of fear, or differently, a sign of weakness. Now, to this Saka then responded very nicely. It is neither through fear nor weakness that I am patient with Wepachiti. How can a wise person like me engage in combat with a fool? Of goals that culminate in one's own good, none is found better than patience. One who repays an angry man or woman with anger, one wins a battle hard to win. One who repays an angry man with anger, one wins a battle hard to win. He practices for the welfare of both one's own and the others, when knowing that one's foe is angry, and mindfully maintains his or her peace. When one achieves the cure of both one's own and the others, the people who consider him a fool are unskilled in the Dhamma. So patience is then, in the words of Saka, not a sign of fear, not a sign of weakness, but rather comes out of a mind that is well developed, the mind that is filled with wholesome states, and that certainly then is a mental quality that certainly leads to the benefit of both, that helps to calm down or to appease the anger of the enemy. So if one can see that one's enemy is angry, and one knows that this anger will not be good for one's enemy, nor for oneself, then simply to take a more a wiser approach, and then thinking for the benefit of the enemy as well as for one's own, one simply responds with patience. So this is a much more mature form of dealing with the challenging situation. Now, Dhammapada verse 399 states the following, and we're coming to an end. Him or her I call a Brahmana, who without anger endures abuse, beating and being bound, to whom the strength of patience is like the strength of an army. Now, in the Mangala Sutta, the discourse on blessings, patience is certainly mentioned as certainly one the quality. So patience, gentleness, meeting those who have calmed the mental defilements and discussing the Dhamma on suitable occasion. This is the highest blessing. So allow me to conclude today's Satya Dhamma talk by wishing may you see and appreciate the benefits of patience, and may you have plenty of opportunities to further or to develop patience, to further deepen your patience, and ultimately may patience lead you all the way to Nibbana within this very retreat here. And this is it. Jim, what was your point?
Raises a couple of questions. And the first is that our practice always begins with the focus on a particular object, usually the breath, and the rising and falling of the abdomen. But more and more I begin to see that what the practice engenders is a second object of the meditation, namely the stance of my meditative practice. So I'm not looking just at the object, I'm looking at the way I'm looking at the object. How am I approaching the exercise? So there are two objects here.
That's fine, sure. The attitude with which you observe.
And that more and more it seems as I listen to the talk that the most important part of the practice is the meditator himself or herself. What's the quality that I'm bringing to the exercise of observing this Vipassana object? And if it's wanting, then that's the object of my practice.
So what you're adding an important aspect to the talk, namely to also be patient with one's own failings, or to be patient with one's attitude towards practice. Yeah. No, that's a well taken point. Yes, it's good. So to give you a practical illustration for this, if time and again the mind goes off into the future, or it goes off into the past, and gets carried away by thinking, then one might get pretty upset about this after a while. And in it, and certainly then one might certainly get upset with this certain particular attitude or this particular pattern of the mind. Or it could be, just as another example, if one finds that one is pretty goal-oriented or very competitive in one's practice. If one sees it time and again, then, and one sees this useless pattern, then to be patient with it one more time, and certainly eventually such a useless pattern will gradually weaken. I know. So your point is well taken. Patience also towards one's own shortcomings, be those mental qualities or the attitude with which we practice.
It's as though the arrow is a double-headed arrow. I'm not just looking at the object.
That's it.
I'm looking
That's
at
it.
the person looking.
Correct. Sure.
Yeah.
No, and it's in this way too. That when we look at on occasion at the attitude with which we practice, that we can then bring about changes, and probably such an not so skillful attitude that we're mindful of during intensive retreat that might then also occur during daily life, and so if we can weaken it during intensive retreat, we'll also weaken it for daily life. And will suffer less. Anything else?
Well, the second part is probably too hard. Not that the first part was easy, but it's the state of the world and patience in regards to, your own example that we share of the state of the environment in Lumbini. And how, despite our efforts, it continues to deteriorate. And
do you mind if I turn?
One maintain a sense of patience.
Do you mind if I turn this off?